just juxtapose these three things together and call it a whole, it's a collection of things that is right now juxtaposed and even touching together. That's a whole. But because the parts are not interacting with one another, it's not a whole that has properties of its own, what is called emergent properties. The concept of emergent property is one of the most important concepts in philosophy today, for a variety of reasons that I want to explain to you right now. An emergent property is a property is a property of a whole that emerges from the interactions between its parts. As long as the parts interact with one another, the whole now has properties that cannot be reduced to the parts. The concept of emergent property is very important philosophically because it stops reductionism. When everybody says, well, if everything is made of atoms, ultimately, then basically all there is atoms. Well, no. Because once atoms begin interacting together and form molecules, molecules have properties of their own. For instance, you have atoms of hydrogen and atoms of oxygen. As long as the two are separate, both are fuels, both are combustible. If you have some fire going on here, you throw some oxygen, the fire is going to get larger. If you have some fire there and you throw hydrogen, the fire is going to become larger. So both are combustibles. But you put hydrogen and oxygen together to form water, and the molecule of water now has properties of its own. You throw that water into the fire, and it puts out the fire. Right? Even though it's made out of two combustible things, even though the oxygen by itself would have made the fire bigger, and the hydrogen by itself would have made the fire bigger, water, which is just oxygen and hydrogen, puts out the fire. So water has properties that its molecules don't have. That's what an emergent property is. Because now hydrogen and oxygen are interacting in the molecule. And some of their own properties are being cancelled, and now the entire molecule of water has new properties. Yes?
Just fast, is this the same thing that we call mechanic theory?
No, but I'll get to that later. We're going to get to that tomorrow in the second class, I think, because the machine phylum really has to do with that immanent, impersonal God that I sort of mentioned yesterday, the God of Spinoza. But before I even begin to talk about anything spiritual, I need to talk about the most scientific things possible so that you can, once we get there, you can possibly think that I'm a New Age hippie. Otherwise, I'm going to have to shoot myself. So, this is a very, very important concept because it stops reductionism. Reductionism is another one of those philosophical maneuvers that has to be excluded from the beginning. Not only molecules cannot be reduced to atoms, but persons cannot be reduced to their genes, as many reductionist geneticists would want to say. Well, everything is in your genes. Everything you are is in your genes, so you can be reduced to your genes. Well, no. Your genes are there and are real, but there are several levels of emergence between your genes and yourself. The proteins and enzymes that those genes produce, the cells that those proteins and enzymes form, the tissues that those cells in turn form, the organs those tissues form, the systems of organs like the digestive system, your circulatory system, those tissues, those organs, and then the whole organism, and then the whole ecosystem that you belong to. Every single level of a part-to-whole relationship is irreducible to the previous one as long as the parts interact and as long as they produce or cause new properties to emerge. This little collection of objects that I have here doesn't have any emergent properties. It's simply a sum of its parts. Whereas an emergent property is more than the sum of its parts. That's not the best possible formula. The best formula is a property that emerges from the interactions, but in the old times, the formula used to be a property that's more than the sum of its parts, and it used to be explained also with a physical example. For example, metallic alloys like bronze. Bronze is made out of copper and tin. That's all bronze is. Copper and tin in certain proportions. When you measure how strong copper is, you can put it in a little machine that pulls it until it breaks, and then it gives you a certain number at which point, how much force you have to apply before it broke. You measure that it is, say, it can take 5 pounds per inch of force before it breaks, say. So it's 5 pounds per inch strong. Then you take tin, and it breaks even easier, I'd say 2 pounds per inch. So that means that bronze, 5 and 2, should be 7 pounds per inch. And yet when you put bronze and measure it, and it breaks at about 12 pounds per inch. In other words, it has more strength than the sum of the strengths of its components. That's the source of expression. Emergent properties are more than the sum of their parts. That little collection of objects that they just destroyed it for me. Thank you. Doesn't have any emergent properties because it's just the sum of its parts. Just 2 cups plus a bottle. Nothing else emerged there because they are not interacting with one another. They are just juxtaposed. So certain wholes are mere collections. But the wholes that we want to study here are always wholes with emergent parts.
Could a person be considered to be emergent property?
A person can be considered to be an emergent property because our minds emerge from interactions between our neurons, and yet they cannot be reduced to neurons. Right? I mean, something emerges on the brain that is not the brain itself, but that depends on the interactions between brain parts. Right? They take your cerebellum out, or they take your front, like what they used to do when they lobotomized poor people like in the 50s, right? We're going to lobotomize this guy. And your mind goes away too, or at least a good part of your mind. You're not kind of a zombie, right? So you depend on those parts still being there, but because the mind is emergent, it cannot be reduced to the brain. Right? So emergence is an incredibly important concept because it stops reductionism. When you say, many economists try to reduce all social processes to individual rational choice. That's reductionism. They're saying, there are no emergent properties in society. There are no organizations or communities or nation states or cities. Everything is ultimately reducible to rational choices made by individuals as to what to buy, what to sell. That type of economics is reductionist. It's reducing everything to the level of the person. And so what we need to avoid at all levels is reduction, whether it's reduction to atoms, whether it's reduction to genes, whether it's reduction of all social entities to persons, whether it's reduction of the mind to the brain, any kind of reduction, and the concept of emergence, a property that emerges from the interactions between the parts, is our weapon. The concept of emergence now is used in every field of science. It's a perfectly valid and well-recognized notion, and so we're not like postulating some, kind of a controversial idea here. It's a well-understood notion. You can explain the mechanisms through which the properties that emerge. So in other words, you can give an explanation for emergence. You don't have to just take it for granted. And it stops the idea that you can reduce everything to a single level, which is a tendency that a lot of academic fields, whether in the natural sciences or in the social sciences, tend to have. Geneticists want to reduce everything to genes, physicists want to reduce everything to atoms, and so on. Everybody tries to reduce everything to their own particular field. Needless to say, reducing everything to signifiers is also reductionism. It's the kind of reductionism practiced in cultural studies, or in another field. Every field seems to want to reduce everything to the entities that they study. As philosophers, what we want to do is take advantage of all those different fields in their own autonomy and their own independence, precisely because we are not trying to reduce everything to anything else.